A billionaire thought he had the perfect test to expose greed. But when a young black girl caught him off guard, he saw something that shattered everything he believed about trust and character. What happens next will make you question how far people will go to protect their own biases, and how one act of pure honesty can change the course of a life. How can a simple moment of truth turn into a battle against hate? This is the story that nobody saw coming. David Harris was a self-made billionaire, known for his sharp mind and relentless drive. He had built his empire from the ground up, but despite all his success, something felt off. He surrounded himself with power, wealth, and prestige, but never stopped to truly see the people who worked for him. That was until he hired Leah, a hard-working single mother who came to clean his mansion each week. Her daughter, Maya, was only 6, but she had a quiet strength about her, something that caught David's attention in a way he didn't expect. David, always seeking to control everything around him, thought he could test their loyalty. What began as a simple experiment would set off a series of events that forced David to confront the very prejudices he never thought he had. But little did he know, this test would unravel more than just a few assumptions. It would expose a truth that could change his life forever. David's test wasn't supposed to be anything more than a harmless observation, a way to gauge trust and integrity. But it had already begun to unravel in ways he hadn't expected. He'd left a small fortune in cash on the counter, with the faint hope that someone would take it, just for a moment of weakness. He never expected Maya to walk into that room and organize the money neatly instead of touching a single bill. The shock of her actions stayed with him for days. Was it possible that such purity existed? But the more David watched Leah and Maya, the more he realized just how different their lives were from his. Leah worked tirelessly, doing the kind of work no one wanted to see, while David went about his days in meetings, conferences, and luxury. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking about how much dignity they held in their quiet struggle. The first sign of real trouble came one late afternoon when David was walking through the mansion. He overheard a conversation between his VP, Greg Turner, and a couple of other senior managers. They were talking about Leah, how she wasn't a good fit for the company's image. Greg, with his cold tone and dismissive sneer, called her too uppity for a woman of her background. David's stomach turned. Was this really what went on behind the scenes? But when he approached Greg, trying to brush it off as a misunderstanding, Greg had the nerve to laugh it off. It wasn't the first time someone had made a disparaging remark about Leah and Maya, but it hit David differently. Was he really blind to the system of inequality that was right under his nose? And then it all came crashing down. One evening, as Leah was leaving the mansion after finishing her work, David noticed something strange. She seemed flustered, glancing over her shoulder like someone was watching her. When she reached her car, a black SUV pulled up beside her. 2 men stepped out, men David knew all too well. One was Greg Turner. The other was Richard Bryant, the head of security, who was known for his racist and crude behavior. The two exchanged a few words with Leah, and it didn't look friendly. David watched from the window, the anger bubbling up inside him. He wanted to intervene, but he knew he had to stay hidden, to understand what was happening before taking action. The next morning, Leah came in with a bruise on her arm, but she quickly hid it when she saw David watching. She acted as though everything was fine, as if it were just another day. But something in her eyes told him it wasn't. A few days later, David was called into an impromptu meeting with Richard and Greg. The air was thick with tension. Richard's voice was harsh as he accused Leah of misplacing company property. She was seen with a Rolex, Richard claimed. And we've had thefts before. David's blood ran cold. He knew Leah. There was no way she would steal. But Richard was insistent, his eyes narrowing with a predatory gleam. David's first instinct was to shut it down, but the evidence was damning. A stolen Rolex found in Leah's cleaning cart? The accusations hung in the air like a heavy fog. He told Richard to investigate further, but in the back of his mind, something didn't sit right. The whole thing felt orchestrated. As the days passed, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. He had watched Leah work tirelessly, with honesty and grace, yet here she was, being framed for something she didn't do. He had seen this kind of thing before, people of color being wrongly accused, punished, and forgotten. But this was different. Leah wasn't just an employee to him anymore, she was a symbol of everything he had ignored in his life. The next morning, David made a decision. He couldn't trust the system within his own company anymore, not with people like Greg and Richard in charge. He secretly hired Marcus, a former FBI investigator, to look into the accusations against Leah. Marcus didn't hesitate. He had seen it all before. He assured David that they would catch whoever was behind this. But as they dug deeper, the truth became even murkier. David wasn't sure if he was angrier at the system he had built, or at himself for not seeing it sooner. And just when they thought they had everything under control, Marcus discovered something shocking. Leah wasn't the only one being targeted. It was a conspiracy. The more they uncovered, the more the web of racism and manipulation spread across the company. David felt the ground slipping beneath him. Everything he thought he knew about fairness and loyalty was beginning to crumble. Would he be able to expose the truth before it was too late? Or was he already too far gone in his own complicity to make a difference? The day the truth came crashing down, David was prepared for a confrontation, but not like this. He had spent days researching, digging into the accusations, gathering evidence, and relying on Marcus to uncover the truth. He had known something was off with Richard's claim about the Rolex, but he didn't realize how deep the conspiracy ran. The moment of revelation came when Marcus returned to David's office with a file in hand, one that would shatter everything David thought he knew about his company. "You were right," Marcus said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Leah wasn't the target, she was just a pawn. Greg and Richard have been running a scheme for years, using their positions to manipulate employees, steal from the company, and destroy anyone who stood in their way. But they didn't stop there. They'd been using their power to set people like Leah up for crimes they didn't commit, ensuring they stayed in control, making sure the system protected them." David's heart raced. He had suspected something was wrong, but this was more than he could have imagined. It wasn't just a few false accusations. It was a pattern, one of corruption and racism embedded deep within his company's foundation. And now, it had turned into a personal betrayal. He had to act fast. If he didn't, Leah's life, her reputation, and everything she had worked for would be destroyed by people who only saw her as a means to an end. As he prepared to confront Richard and Greg, a cold wave of dread washed over him. He was about to expose the very men who had helped him build his empire. Would they fight back? Would they destroy him in the process? David's palms were sweaty as he made his way through the halls of the office building, the weight of everything hanging on his shoulders. He entered the conference room, where Greg and Richard were already sitting, waiting for him. The room felt suffocating, and as David stood at the door, he realized just how outnumbered he felt. But he couldn't back down. He couldn't let these men destroy everything. "I know what you've been doing," David said, his voice steady, but every word felt like it took everything in him to say. He placed the file on the table, evidence of their corruption, the false accusations, the forged documents, and the years of manipulation. "I know about the Rolex, about the way you've been using Leah as your scapegoat, and the countless other employees you've ruined to protect your own secrets." Greg and Richard sat frozen, their faces pale. They had never expected David to catch on. But as the seconds dragged on, their shock quickly turned into anger. Richard slammed his fist on the table. "You think you can ruin everything we've worked for?" Richard sneered. "You're nothing without us." David's blood boiled, but he didn't flinch. He had heard enough. "I don't need you. And neither does Leah. I'm ending this now." The room seemed to hold its breath. Richard stood, his fists clenched, eyes wild. But before he could speak, David's phone rang. It was Leah. "David," she said, her voice shaky. "They've just fired me. They've called the police. They're accusing me of stealing again. They're saying I took something from the office. I don't know what to do." David's heart stopped. This was it. He had been one step behind the whole time. Richard and Greg had orchestrated the final blow. The police were already on their way. "Get out of there," David said, his voice sharp. "I'll take care of it. Stay safe." David hung up and turned to face Richard and Greg. His mind was racing, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let them ruin another life. "You've made a mistake," David said, locking eyes with both men. "You're not just destroying one person's life, you're destroying everything I've built. But I'm going to make sure you pay for it." He turned and stormed out of the room, his every step fueled by the knowledge that he was about to take everything they'd worked for and expose them for the frauds they truly were. ***. David didn't know what to expect when he reached the police station, but what he found there shattered him. Leah was sitting in the waiting area, surrounded by officers, her face pale but her eyes still holding on to a flicker of defiance. When she saw David, her shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. He rushed over, asking if she was okay, but she just shook her head. "I'm just tired," she whispered. "Tired of fighting for something I didn't even do. Tired of always being seen as less than." David looked at her, feeling the weight of his own guilt. He had seen it, the way Leah and others like her were treated. He had witnessed her work harder than anyone else, only to be dragged down by a system built on prejudice. For so long, he had stood on the sidelines, thinking he was doing enough. But the truth was he wasn't. And neither was anyone else. The police officer who had been questioning Leah came over and handed David the file with the evidence against her. There was no charge, nothing to hold her on, but the damage had already been done. The accusations, the humiliation, it had all taken a toll. David watched her as she stood, gathering her things, her dignity intact but fragile. He walked her out of the station, the cold night air hitting them both like a reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. But as they stepped into the street, David knew something had changed in him. He wasn't going to let this go. Not for Leah, not for anyone else. David fired Greg and Richard the very next day. The scandal was impossible to ignore. The company, which had prided itself on its success, had become a symbol of the very corruption and racism it had always ignored. The media swarmed, exposing the web of discrimination, manipulation, and lies that had been ingrained in its operations. But David didn't stop there. He set up a fund to help workers like Leah, people who had been wrongfully accused or unfairly treated. He pushed for diversity training, for accountability, for the kind of change that wasn't just cosmetic but rooted in real action. He pledged to donate a significant portion of his wealth to support education and opportunity for those who had been systematically denied it. Leah, after a long battle, was reinstated, this time as a leader, not just a victim. She became the Director of Human Resources, a position she had earned long before the company ever realized it. Her life had changed, yes, but it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a space where the people who had been overlooked could finally be seen and heard. And as for Richard and Greg, their downfall was swift and unforgiving. They lost everything, their careers, their reputations, and most importantly, their place in a world that had once protected them. Richard, facing criminal charges, was exposed for the racist, manipulative man he had always been. Greg, who had once hidden behind his corporate power, was left with nothing but the wreckage of his own making. David watched as Leah took her new role with quiet strength, but he could see the scars. She would never forget what she had been through, what had almost broken her. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just about one person or one company. This was about a system of oppression that ran deep, and the ripple effects it had on everyone in its path. He thought of Maya, Leah's daughter, who had taught him so much about honesty and integrity. She was still young, but the world she would grow up in would be shaped by the choices they made today. And David knew that he couldn't let this story end here. Racial injustice wasn't something that could be fixed with one act of bravery, or a few decisions made behind closed doors. It wasn't a problem that could be solved in a day, or a week, or even a year. It was a battle that would take time, effort, and most of all, a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. David had learned that the hard way. But in the end, the question remained, how many more lives would be shattered before we stop pretending this isn't happening? How many more voices would be silenced? The truth is, this wasn't just one story, it was the story of so many. People like Leah, like Maya, like countless others, who have been forced to fight for their place in a world that wasn't built for them. Now it was time to act. Will we wait until the next person falls? Or will we stand up, speak out, and demand the kind of world where equality isn't just an idea, but a reality? Because the truth is, we all have a role to play in this story. The question is, what will you do about it?